My name is Alan Beavers. Alongside me for the very first episode of the Albums Only podcast is Jacob Slater. Jacob, thank you for joining me.
It's an honor. Beavers.
And I know people don't know, unless you happen to be one of the very few lucky people who lived in Morgantown, West Virginia. We used to do a radio show together, the top 20 countdown of the week of WWVU-FM, 91.7 The Moose. We used to do that together. Had a lot of fun doing that.
Before U92 got good, apparently.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah, they're winning awards all the time now.
I like to think we put them on the map, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I mean, they're like, oh, that's the Beeves and Slater station. Yeah.
Right. That's how the buzz got started. You know, all the people who came before the ones who get the credit are the ones who did all the work, as you know.
Yeah, these kids have nothing to do with it. They didn't do it.
Right. We'll take all the credit. Don't worry about them.
Album Only podcast. Really excited. Generally speaking, I don't really listen to that much music in my daily life. Not since my radio station days, actually, have I really sat down and listened to music that often. It's like a once every other week kind of thing.
Well, you know, that's kind of sad because you really enjoyed your role at U92 when we were both DJs there, and you obviously had really good taste in music, and you obviously still do, and you're something that you seem to really enjoy. So it's kind of sad to hear that, but if I have to, hop you on the bandwagon and join me here on the very first podcast, then that's what I got to do, man.
Really, the two things I like to do are hang out with my friends and just talk for hours on stuff I care about. So if I can talk at length about random crap and people listen to it, I think I'm in the best possible world.
Well, that's good. The caveat there is, of course, if people listen to it, which is really the question.
Hey, we're the Studio 92 guys, Beaves. I think people are gonna listen.
Right. The name of the show was Studio 92. It was a top 20 countdown show. I'd like to thank Casey Kasem for getting me interested in that. So that was kind of cool. But no, thanks for joining me, Jacob. And again, for everyone who's listening, this is the Albums Only podcast. And what we're going to do is each episode of the podcast, we're going to review an album. We're going to talk about it, talk about the artist, talk about the artist's other albums, so just, a little bit of periphery about them, not getting too much into them, but just sort of discuss them a little bit. And then we're going to actually talk about the album in question and go over our thoughts about the album, the critical response to the album, and of course the contributions to the album that the artist notes or perhaps are of note to us, or just what we sort of notice about the album there. And so the very first podcast we've reserved for an individual who passed just recently and who Jacob and I both have a lot of love for, and that's David Bowie. And the album we decided to tackle was one that unfortunately I think Jacob really hadn't delved too deeply into before we decided to do this, which is David Bowie's Blackstar, which is his last album, 2016, released on his birthday, on his 69th birthday, and he passed a few days later. So it's shocking, but again, it's a really good album. I think people are, if you haven't heard it, or you're a Bowie fan, you're sort of familiar with his peripheral works, famous ones, then you'll really like what you hear here. So before we get started with that, Jacob, did you have any other thoughts or anything else you wanted to go into? Or
like I said, both of us are big Bowie fans, and I guess it kind of seems strange to say that I'm a Bowie fan and yet only just now listened to his last album. I don't know. I don't think I was in the right headspace to listen to it. Drifted away from music a bit. I had life and everything, and then it was a really kind of shocking time. Blackstar comes out, and then kind of immediately afterwards he passes away, which, I don't know, it kind of struck me because it was kind of similar actually to how it went with my grandfather, who passed, I think, about 10 years or so ago now. It's that, it's just the suddenness that he went into the hospital for something. The diagnosis comes, and then, it was like all in one weekend. Like he just kind of went, passed on, and I don't know. It's like the quickness and the immediacy of the event that kind of struck me the wrong way, I guess. And obviously obviously with such a talent like David Bowie, who you kind of always hoped would kind of just last forever, because he seemed like this mythic kind of supernatural figure in a lot of ways. They always kind of hoped he'd just like last on and continue making records. And by all accounts, David Bowie did not consider this to be his like last testament. He was still planning on making music. He was still planning on continuing on.
That's actually very interesting, because I've heard both accounts here. I mean, if you listen to Blackstar itself, I don't, we're going to kind of mess with the structure here, but what's really interesting, if you listen to Blackstar itself, I mean, there's so many references to his impending, death. He knew, he was obviously very self-aware of this. I think you listen to the album itself, you listen to songs like Lazarus, and even the last track's title is, I Can't Give It All Away, sort of like, I can't tell you all the secrets I can't tell you what everything means, every song that I've ever done. Obviously, I think he knew, the end could be nigh. I think he knew that. But it's also true, and you're right, that he was still working on stuff up until he died. He'd still planned to make another album, as Tony Visconti, his, longtime producer of Blackstar, noted. He was intending to keep on going. But I also think that this album is sort of his, in a way, is sort of his last will and testament. I think if it had ended up not being, that would have been okay, and he still would have made a great album. But it's, almost the artistic quality of making a song, I think, making an album, about his impending death, and then, dying a few days later is, aside from the terrible tragedy that it is that you lose a man and, his wife and his young daughter, lose their father and their husband, it's also fascinating in that it's a great work of art. I mean, what more can you do to write an album you're considered your best in many, 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 many years about your death, and then you die 2 or 3 days later? I mean, that's if anyone, who better could do that than David Bowie? That's just amazing.
The fact that he could view it in an objective artistic sense, I think, is very important. I think the only person who faced death musically as well as David Bowie was probably, I'd say, Johnny Cash on his last couple albums. I think there's a definite sense of being able to confront one's mortality, and be able to produce amazing work despite, this thing hanging over you. It was Bowie's last album. It was also his first album in 3 years. The album before that was The Next Day, which was his first album in 10 years. The last album before that was Reality, released in 2003. Did you ever listen to The Next Day?
So what's fascinating is, and when we were both DJs, which there are people here who are going to listen to this, potentially people, let's hope there are people who listen to this. There are people who are going to listen to this and say, man, they talk about the year 2013 a lot. Well, we were both actually DJs during that time. You might have left early in 2013, I think, or graduated maybe towards the middle of 2013. But I was a DJ largely for 2012 and 2013, and of course, David Bowie's The Next Day came out in 2013. And The Next Day, I have on vinyl. I like it quite a lot. I think it's a really good album. I think it's a good comeback album after such a hiatus. But I find David Bowie's albums from this period in the 2000s and onward, which would be Heathen, Reality, The Next Day, and of course Blackstar, to be actually really good high points in David Bowie's career. I think 2002's Heathen and 2003's Reality are really good sort of adult pop, adult contemporary kind of stuff. I like Reality more than I like Heathen, although it seems to me, from what I can gather, the general consensus is Heathen is considered better. I find Reality to be a really good album. I find the high points are really good. I think Fall Dog Bombs the Moon is really good. I think Pablo Picasso, I believe, is wonderful. and that's actually a remake of a Modern Lovers track, and he just brings a whole new life to it. I think it's great. So I find his early 2000s work solid. Heathen 2 has a song called Sunday on it. It's the first track on the album. It's great too. I mean, it's just, and the whole album has its ups and its downs. He has a cover of the Pixies' Cactus on there, which is good. It's good. It's sort of similar to the Pixies' own version in a way, but anytime you cover the Pixies, you run the risk of not being as good as the original, unfortunately. But yeah, I think the early 2000s work is really good. And I think that The Next Day is really good as well. I think song for song, it's really wonderful. The title track on that is great. Dancing Out in Space is a great pop hit that could have been really good for him, like in the 80s. If he had released that could have been a top 40 hit. Yeah, so I think The Next Day was really good. I enjoyed it. Did you have any thoughts on it? Or?
Well, I didn't listen to it the whole way through at the time. I remember really enjoying it, and I seem to recall the feelings around the station to be generally positive. But it was a good album. I think like the tragic thing is that it was such a good comeback album. It kind of implied, that this was going to be a next great era for David Bowie, but obviously it kind of was cut short.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right about that. I think it was implied, and I think at the time, I mean, even at the time in 2013, he didn't know about his, impending demise, a couple years later. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it really was going to be Bowie's sort of comeback for another 10 or 20 years or however long.
And I mean, I think at this stage, not talking directly about Blackstar yet, but I think at this stage at Bowie's career, I don't think there was like this pressure to kind of reinvent the wheel as such. I mean, you see like, in the 90s, you had like, he was doing like electronic stuff, outside, Earthling, kind of the drum and bass stuff. And then like in the early 2000s, Bowie has gotten better at kind of reproducing, like reinventing the sounds of, the era in which he's recording.
I agree with you that there's sort of there's sort of this debate, right, between whether David Bowie is really a chameleon who is always at the cutting edge, like is perceived in the 70s, and then whether he's a step behind and trying to catch up in the 1990s. I think there is sort of a debate maybe to be had about that. But speaking on that note, let's go ahead and let's go back a little bit and just talk about the back catalog. Because, I mean, with David Bowie, it's practically endless. You've got 20-some albums, depending on how you want to count them, of his work. Potentially even 30 if you want to consider 30-some of them, if you want to consider live works and so many other projects and whatnot. But let's go back there and let's go back to the early part of David Bowie's career and just sort of start there. What was the earliest album that you recall or really, struck a chord with you?
I've talked about this with you Beebs many times. Probably got to be Hunky Dory, released in 1971. And there's like a weird kind of connection to this, because the main reason I got into this album, because there's a song on this album, Queen Bitch, kind of a Velvet Underground kind of song. And I got through that through The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, which is like that Bill Murray, Wes Anderson film, Wes Anderson being Wes Anderson. And there's an artist in that movie, I believe he's Portuguese, and he performs Portuguese covers of David Bowie songs. And I think at the climax of that movie, he's doing a Portuguese version of Queen Bitch. And I was like at that stage in my life where I would just kind of like go through forums and I'd go through lists of like people that users would recommend, like, oh, you should, people talking about Danzig, I write that down because, I'm autistic and I got to write 50 million lists of things. I just like write down like names and names and names, and I just like go through it and I'd listen to it, or I'd get an album from the library and I'd listen to it. All that leads back around to Queen Bitch, Hunky Dory, which was honestly like the first album period, I think, by David Bowie that I was really into. Like the entire album itself is like, I think, the epitome of like early 70s pop, the last gasp of T-Rex and all this kind of glitter glam pop stuff before David Bowie would kind of like put a pin on it with Ziggy Stardust and Spiders from Mars. It's a strange kind of pre-Ziggy album, I think. Yeah, Hunky Dory, probably the first album I was really into.
Well, I have to say there's some really good, I mean, good tracks for people who don't know, and I'm sure a lot of people who would listen to this would know, but Changes, Oh You Pretty Things, Life on Mars, like you said, Queen Bitch is on there. I mean, and it's considered a great album. It's considered a classic. So, obviously, and that's a great place to start. What were your other thoughts there?
Just that, like, probably the other album that kind of really stuck with me, I think, was probably Station to Station, obviously, is a good one, but the one that stuck with me through the years, I think, is Young Americans, which I've talked about. I've even wrote about it back when U92 was attempting to revive its, I don't know what you call it, a zine. I was kind of contracted to write some album reviews. I decided to go with Young Americans because it was an album that I never really heard talked about all that often. It was a kind of a weird period in David Bowie's career. It was prior to his creative resurgence, I guess you could say, with the Berlin albums, which he worked on with Brian Eno. And this Young Americans is like the only album in Bowie's Plastic Soul, as it was called, period, where he was kind of reinventing soul music and funk music through distinctly non-American, non-African American. It's a very intriguing album to me. It's very plastic soul in a way that it kind of strips away a lot of the natural flow and rhythm that you'd associate with soul music. Puts it in a weird Bowie box. And obviously it also had great commercial success, as it was the album that contained Fame.
Which is fascinating to me because I have to note here, apparently, Bowie talks about this, that he was working with John Lennon and they came up with the riff on Fame. And, that was it. I mean, all it takes is working with a Beatle and you got a hit, right?
And Lennon actually does the chorus for that song as well.
Right.
Those are Hunky Dory and Young Americans. They're like the two Bowie albums that I always kind of come back to.
For me, it's the very first Bowie album that I had heard and that I got into was Ziggy Stardust, and I thought it was good. I was young; I was probably 16 or 17, so and I was just starting to learn as much as I could about music. But I really found Station to Station to be the first one with which I really had a connection with, and I think from Station to Station, Low and Heroes, the Berlin trilogy, even Lodger, I think, which is very underrated. Lodger too. I find myself more drawn to Bowie in those mid to late 70s. I think the general zeitgeist view is sort of out there amongst the populace is that the early 70s albums with Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory are the best. Aladdin Sane is another one. Are where Bowie really came on the map, and it's true, he did there. I find the mid to late 70s albums really good. I mean, I find everything basically, and Young Americans is good. I like that. I'll be honest with you, I like some of the Young Americans B-sides better, like John, I'm Only Dancing, Knock on Wood. Those are really good, and they're not on the album. But I find everything from basically Station to Station up through Scary Monsters. So from Station to Station to Low to Heroes to Lodger to Scary Monsters. I mean, that's a run of really great albums to me. So I really enjoy those, and I can really relate to those. So yeah, I hear you on that point about the 70s and how influential they are. It's really interesting, though, that either of us could listen to Bowie from the 70s at any point and still, love what we're hearing. This brings me to something else that I'd like to talk about, which I have a bone to pick with, which is that Bowie gets maligned for his 80s work and even for some of his 90s work. And I don't know how familiar you are with these. I mean, even Bowie himself famously didn't really care for the work he did in the 80s, aside from a few songs here and there. But I have to tell you, I don't dislike some of Bowie's 80s work. Now, it's totally poppy. It's totally pop. And it's got a sheen to it, so I can understand if people aren't drawn to it or don't think it's his best work, because it's not, but it still has a special place with me. So, like, Let's Dance, which is 1983, which is where he sort of starts this pop phase. I mean, that song is pretty much, I mean, the song and the album, they got some real winners on there. Do you have any familiarity with that?
Yeah, I remember Let's Dance. It's very, I don't really see it as being all that different from the ideal Bowie. I think it's very poppy, but I think it's a very sexy song. Like, it's a very slinky song. Honestly, I haven't listened to the whole album. Looking at it right now, obviously Let's Dance, very good song. China Girl was, I believe, a song that Bowie wrote for Iggy Pop for his 1977 album, The Idiot. Very good song as well.
Yeah, they both have credit for the songwriting on that as well. So yeah, China Girl, and then Modern Love as well. I think it's a great song, and it leads it off. I mean, this is a really front-loaded album, like Modern Love, China Girl, Let's Dance. Those are the first three tracks. And then even, which is a really good track towards the end, is Cat People, Putting Out Fire, which he wrote with Giorgio Moroder. So that's interesting as well.
I can see where people would think that, and even Bowie would think that kind of going into a more poppy direction would kind of, inversely affect quality of his music. It's like selling out. And I'm not going to say that Bowie didn't kind of play the pop star game a bit. I mean, we all have seen the music video with him and Mick Jagger doing Dancing in the Street. But I don't necessarily think that Bowie doing the pop star thing is necessarily bad. I mean, we've already seen, very experimental stuff, obviously, with the Berlin trilogy. But Bowie was kind of always in his heart a pop star. He's always kind of doing pop music. It's just like he puts his own spin on it. I mean, we go back to like his very first popular album, Space Oddity. He's doing like the Beatles, White Album, Abbey Road kind of hippie space stuff. So I think he might have felt himself to be like in a kind of creative slump, but I don't think it's like necessarily not Bowie to like start digging into the synths and kind of like doing pop stuff. Because I think he always does pop stuff. It's just the nature of pop music itself kind of changes.
That's a great point. And I think from 1983's Let's Dance, you go on to 1984's Tonight, which he again works with Iggy Pop on a handful of songs. He also does the title track from that. There's Loving the Alien, which he says was actually way better in concept of a song than the end product. I don't know. I think the end product's pretty good myself. He also worked with, I think Tina Turner also appears on with him on one of these songs as well there. I think actually, on Tonight itself. And Iggy Pop also sings with him along with him in Dancing with the Big Boys in 1984's Tonight. And then you go on to 1987, and this is, now, usually when I see lists compiled of David Bowie's best to worst albums or something of that sort, 1987's Never Let Me Down, it usually gets the top mark. And I think that's really wrong. I don't want to defend Never Let Me Down too much, but there's actually some decent stuff on this album. And again, it's still very pop. I understand that. I understand he had been doing sort of the 80s pop thing for, 2 albums. But you have songs that he liked, like Time Will Crawl, Day In and Day Out, Never Let Me Down. And these songs aren't bad songs. Now, they're very poppy, I'll grant you. But I don't think that album was as bad as people say, and I think there's actually some good songs on it. And I know I'm probably in the minority there. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add about the 80s before we go into the 90s there, Jacob?
Just that I think it's kind of become the common belief that artists that were popular in like the 60s and 70s naturally started falling into a slump in the 1980s. Obviously, the big name I can think of that is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's 80s albums are kind of classically considered to be his low point of his career before he was able to reinvent himself for really, it took up until I think the 2000s where Dylan was able to reinvent himself. But I think it's just, I don't necessarily think that everybody was, like it was just no one can put out good music. I think it's just that the kind of common perception of what music was and should be had changed at that point. So Bowie, being this kind of this chameleonic figure, was probably able to weather the storm more than most people. But I think the general perception kind of damns him more than perhaps it's necessarily called for.
Right. Well, and, moving on from there, I look at the 1990s, and the 90s are actually very interesting to me when you look at Bowie's trajectory, because I think in the 90s, you've got a little bit of everything. We won't talk about the Tin Machine, which is the band he was in from 1990 to 1992 or something like that. We'll just sort of skip over that. I'm not personally familiar with that period too well, and we'll just go on to sort of where he's the main dog here. So if we go to the 1990s, we're looking at another album which I think is very interesting and actually shows Bowie not being of his time or ahead of his time, or even behind his time, in my eyes. 1993's Black Tie, White Noise is a very interesting album. It's very jazzy, but it's also kind of dance clubby. I don't really know what to make of it. I like some songs on it. I think there's some actually really great work in it, and there's actually some B-sides, too, of his during this period, which are also really good. There's the title track, Black Tie, White Noise, which is a really interesting jazz sort of thing. There's Jump, They Say, a track called Jump, They Say, which is, I believe, about his brother and his mental illness. There's Pallas Athena, which is a really interesting dance track, sort of like a house track. It's really all over the place. Do you have any familiarity with that, or would you like me to just go ahead and move on?
No, I haven't actually listened to too much of Black Tie, White Noise, but I think it kind of follows with what I said earlier, that kind of the 80s up until the early 90s was kind of a period of kind of these older musicians trying to find their footing and kind of find where they stand in this kind of new musical landscape. But I do think that kind of you mentioned house club or house music and everything. I think that is a nice preview to what David Bowie would be interested in his kind of later 90s albums.
Right, so that moves us on to 1995's Outside, or One Period Outside. It was supposed to be the first of, I think, 5 albums with Brian Eno. And he and Eno had actually talked before passing about continuing on with those concepts, but Outside has some interesting work on it too. It's not all bad. It's a very, very weird, interesting album. I mean, the album art itself has what seems like clip art on it, very mid-90s, Windows 95, kind of new agey images on it. It's interesting. I mean, it's very interesting to look at today. And then you move from Outside to Earthling, which I know is one that you have some familiarity with, and it's one that I want to point out too. I hear a lot of concepts and sounds and drum from Earthling on Blackstar. I mean, I there's even some of it that's present in The Next Day, but I never really think he got away from that sort of drum and bass sound in a way. I think that still influenced him quite a bit.
I think David Bowie was as influenced by electronic music as, the greater music consciousness. I mean, we've all kind of shifted more away from kind of traditional rock music into more of a dance club electronic mindset. So I think Earthling is kind of the first Bowie kind of realizing where music is heading and pushing down on that. And of course, house music very popular in Britain in the 90s, and of course for a long while they have a very rich history of house music. So I think it's definitely, when looking at Blackstar, obviously, as you said, you can kind of get a preview for what Blackstar would kind of get into from Earthling, because Earthling is kind of where music was kind of shifting towards, I think, by the late 90s, where we are going more and more into electronic music.
And I think even Black Tie, White Noise with the jazz. I mean, there's a lot of jazz influence there too, and that sort of is reflected in Blackstar. And then from 97's Earthling, we go to 99's Hours, which now here's where I part a little bit with company. I think Hours is bad. Like, it's bad. By almost any standard, it's bad. The guitars have this generic 90s sound to them, like that sort of late 90s, like, really rip-shredding guitar that's really pronounced. I just think Hours is really bad. But it's interesting. It really does mark a transition from Earthling to Heathen, and Heathen is where you really, again, that contemporary adult pop starts to really shine again, so.
Not all that familiar with, but I...
Yeah, and you shouldn't be, don't worry.
It's definitely... I think, like, at this stage of the game, you can kind of see that Bowie is, like, more interesting in, like, a non-rock sense. I mean, obviously his most popular albums, like Heroes and Low, very much dip into electronic music. And I think although Hours and bits of Heathen and Reality are kind of go into rock directions, I think the reception critically of Hours is kind of a sign that Bowie kind of works in less conventional directions, more of electronic and non-traditional formats.
Right. So I think that's probably a good point. So we've talked about the back catalog. I think this is probably now a good point to go into the actual album, Blackstar. We already give it a bit of a primer to it. Released in early January of 2016, Blackstar ended up being the last album of David Bowie's career. He died, again, a few days after it was released. And the album itself, what are your general impressions of Blackstar, Jacob?
For one thing, I really like the minimalist design of the album cover. I think that's what Blackstar and The Next Day have in common, is like very great idea for album cover, very stark. But as for like the content of the album, it's very strange because I think it's like one of Bowie's best albums, and yet like one of his like least able to be recommended albums at the same time, because it's at certain points it is like so unlike stuff that Bowie has done before, in a lot of ways, but at the same time is probably one of the best albums for showcasing why David Bowie was a phenomenal musician, is that he's able to craft like this amazingly textured, distinct album that is David Bowie, but is not David Bowie at the same time. In this album, we've already talked about David Bowie being like influenced by Reflection, being like a statement on the nature of music at the time it's released. There's that, and I think this is an album that borrows very heavily from one of Bowie's musical idols, which is Scott Walker.
Oh, nice. That's a great reference, and you're right about that. But go ahead, continue. I didn't know we didn't talk about this beforehand, so I'm interested to see where you go here.
Really, in the way his singing style is, he presents a singing style in this album. Particularly, I think it's strongest on the first track of the album, the title track, Blackstar. It is very much a Bowie knowingly calling upon Scott Walker. I mean, you hear, starts off very minimalist, Bowie is not singing to sing, he's singing as like a dirge. It's a very haunting opening to an album. I think you can really feel Scott Walker's kind of influence, because Scott Walker, in case people obviously can't find him, it's very much similar that they're influenced by opera, by kind of early German music, and obviously like the tone I think is also very much Scott Walker. Also obviously the lack of focus on traditional kind of instrumentation that you'd expect for rock musicians. It's very much like I believe there's like a lot of strings beginning of Blackstar. Maybe some like, it almost has like an Arabian feel. If you listen to like a Scott Walker album like, say, The Drift, the first track on that, Cossacks Are, you kind of get exactly what Scott Walker is trying to do, which is like paint this bleak undercurrent of dread and menace on those albums. And I think David Bowie, he's taken from Scott Walker, and he's also trying to inspire this kind of feeling of dread and such, because, you know, in a lot of ways it's his swan song. It's a album as
he's feeling it, almost like, you know,
his mortality.
Right.
So I think it's kind of like, it's the most funereal song.
Oh yeah. Well, you know, I might beg to differ with you only maybe on two other tracks too. Lazarus as well is sort of, I think, very funereal, as you said, a good word. And I like that a lot. I think that's a great track, and I Can't Give Everything Away is sort of almost bittersweet. It's actually more upbeat. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do agree with you, though, that Blackstar definitely sets the tone. It's definitely has that sort of ominous feel to it, but still very Bowie.
And especially, you know, like about halfway in, when it kind of kicks up a bit. You know, for an album that you would consider very dark, sad, it is a very kind of energetic album.
Yeah, there's almost like a nervous energy to it, isn't there? Almost like if you knew that if you knew your mortality, your life was at hand.
And especially like in the rhythm section, because the use of drums, I think, Blackstar.
Yep.
It's very, I guess, techno, electronica kind of drums.
Was exactly what I was thinking about with Earthling, and exactly that sort of thing I was thinking about with the next song, "'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore." That really sounds. That's a really unique song. I mean, it's all over the place. It's jazzy, but it's drum and bassy. It's just sort of a weird fusion of everything under the sun, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like you're kind of echoing it out into a void, almost. Kind of has this spacey feel to it. And also a much more expanded instrumentation. I mean, yeah, like saxophone, you got clarinet, I think, in there. You got some piano. And, you know, me, I love saxophone. And Blackstar is heavy on the saxophone.
I think that was Bowie's favorite instrument, by the way, too. I mean, he loved the saxophone, and he liked to play it. And it's really interesting to I assume it's him. It might not be. I didn't look over the liner notes to see if he played it, but it would be unsurprising. It wouldn't be surprising if he did. Let's put it that way.
In some ways, it almost kind of feels like two different songs being played at the same time. Because you got like the very high energy drums just like pounding away. Then you got like saxophone like doing its own thing. You got piano, and you got like Bowie in the middle of this chaos. He's doing lyrics that are like very Bowie, very Scott Walker. It's a very interesting song, I gotta say. For how chaotic it can be, it's also got like a very nice groove to it.
I agree, and so to move on from there, if you move on to Lazarus, I mean, I think if I had to, I'd say this is my favorite song on the album, and I think, I mean, to the first lyric of that song is, "Look up here, I'm in heaven." If there wasn't anything else that was,
like, come on, Bowie.
Yeah.
You're not even making it subtle.
Right. But I think it's a great track. I love it. I think it's the centerpiece here. I mean, Blackstar leads off really well, and it was the title track and the lead track and lead single and all those things. I think, and Lazarus was a single as well. I just think Lazarus is sort of like it's sort of the centerpiece of the funeral, right? Like, it's sort of like the actual procession. Like, you can just see it in your head that, that's what's going on. I love it. I just think it's such a great song.
Yeah, I've also got it down here as like one of my favorite tracks of the album. Blackstar was a good album opener in the fact that I don't think it could be like elsewhere on the album. And if you look at like an album as like its own like artistic piece, and the tracks are kind of like kind of aspects of the album as a whole. Blackstar can only really work, I think, as a title track. Lazarus has the ability to stand out on its own.
You could throw that anywhere on this album. I know, different artists take different perspectives as to where tracks should go, and, producers have so much say, and producers might prefer this or that, and the artist might prefer the other. Lazarus you could throw as the last track if you didn't have I Can't Give Everything Away, which just kind of works almost too perfectly as the last track, but Lazarus could go anywhere and be perfect on this album.
Blackstar works best as an opener, because, you got that slow, kind of haunting stuff that goes on. I Can't Give Everything Away is like the big finale. Everyone's taking a bow.
It's
cheering.
Yeah, I think, isn't that sort of like the epilogue? It's almost like the uplifting epilogue to me. It's almost like, okay, this is all about how, I'm going to be not here anymore, and, here's a little something to remember me by. You know what I mean? Like, you got to move on.
It's the protagonist walking off into the horizon.
Right, exactly.
His job is done. He's moving on.
We'll talk about that a little more later because I find something really interesting about that song. But let's move on to Sue, or In a Season of Crime. Both 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore and Sue were originally composed, I think, a little before some of these other songs. I could be wrong, but I think they were, and they were because they were going to be part of the Lazarus musical that David Bowie was also a part of right before his death. They're very similar, Sue and 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore. They're very, like, jazz rock, would you say?
Yeah, like, very heavy, like, not heavy in, like, in a metal sense, but, like, very heavy and, like...
chaotic, kind of, almost.
Yeah. Like, the drums are pounding away. You got, like, the saxophone squealing. Lazarus, like, beforehand, which is kind of like, at its opening, I kind of almost think of it as like a Strokes song in some ways.
Really? That's very interesting. Okay.
Like, it's Bowie kind of like visiting the state of, like, indie rock. And then Sue is kind of like digging back into, like, the darkness, because it's like bookending, kind of like this 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore. Lazarus is kind of like more of a light-hearted song. It's night driving music, as I've written down. And then, like, Sue is like getting back into the grittiness in a lot of ways.
Right. What's interesting too about Sue, I think, is that it reminds me a lot of some of the work that Bowie did on Outside. It's this sort of, it's chaotic, but there's sort of like, I don't know if it's sort of like, there are moments when there's kind of like a driving synth underneath that just reminds me of Outside so much. It's sort of dour in that way, I guess would be the best way to say it. But it's still very good, and it's it reminds me of some of the best work on the album Outside. If we move on from there to Girl Loves Me, do you have any thoughts about that one in particular?
Well, I've actually got this listed down as one of my favorite tracks on this album. Just because it's like another one of those songs that, although fits within the Blackstar mold, it's like, doesn't really sound like the song that comes before it. It's like, it's very much Bowie reacting to modern hip-hop, almost. Like,
well, that's great, because I agree with you completely, because as I understand it, Bowie was listening to a lot of Kendrick Lamar as well, To Pimp a Butterfly, if I understand. And, you take Girl Loves Me, the song is basically built on the line, where the fuck did Monday go, I believe it is?
Yeah.
And you take that, and it's just, it has this sort of hip-hop connotation. It has this sort of frustration to it. I mean, it does remind me of Kendrick Lamar in a lot of ways. It reminds me of, like, I think that's also, like, there's sort of an anger, right? Like, if you knew that you only had so many days, months on Earth, there's to be sort of that anger, right? Where did the day go? I only have so many of these now, and it's sort of reflected there.
Yeah, it's like a song where you're, like, very out there. Like, you'd hear someone like Danny Brown or something would say it. Mortality, and also kind of this malaise, I think, from living also. You kind of lose track of time. Very Danny Brown. I got, like, the Gorillaz on here. I think Humans, their latest album, very much very much influenced by this heavy, I don't know what you would call it, like drug-induced haze.
And I'm sure Bowie was probably taking drugs at the time, but not the ones that he had took 30 or 40 years earlier. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
I very much sympathize because there have been times where I've been lost in myself, I guess, and wondering where the week has gone, where days have gone, because it all kind of seems to blend together. I think that's why I kind of like this song. But
and then Dollar Days. So what did you have there about Dollar Days?
just that I think this is one of the, I think this and the last track are like one of the more kind of traditional Bowie songs. And I guess by traditional I mean like early 70s. Like the verses themselves, I can kind of see, like they kind of seem very like something that Paul McCartney would have done back in the day. And then you kind of like, obviously, you had like this kind of soft quietness that balloons out, spaciness, which I think is a common theme in Blackstar as well. That things just like kind of expand and explode, I think, musically.
I agree with you there. I think it would work well as a closer itself. It's sort of almost, in a lot of ways, seems to be the closer until, again, the Walk Into the Sunset sort of comes in.
Yeah, I think Dollar Days opens with good, nice saxophone. So, you know, a lot of what I love about this album is like Bowie's kind of reintroduction of the saxophone into his music. Because it kind of provides, I don't know, it kind of makes it feel unique. Because you don't really hear that much saxophone in modern pop music these days. But, yeah, so Dollar Days goes spacey, and then near the end, you start hearing like this synth a little bit that ramps up into the last track, the closing track of the album, I Can't Give Everything Away, which I would say it's also one of my favorite tracks. I'd say it's probably the track that most brings to mind David Bowie as he was.
And I think there's a good reason for that, too. I was going to say, I'll just go back to Dollar Days for a second here, because I really didn't get a chance to comment on it. This is really lyrically, I mean, Dollar Days is like as obvious as it can get. If I'll never see the English evergreens I'm running to, it's nothing to me. Like it's nothing to see. And the last lyrics are, I'm trying to, I'm dying to, I'm trying to, I'm dying to. I mean, it's very, it is very, very sad. I mean, it's a very like dying breath kind of song. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's hard to listen to in retrospect, knowing what was going on. And then I think as you move forward to I Can't Give Everything Away, the reason that, to me, and I was like, when I heard it the first time, I thought, what is that one little sample that keeps coming back? And it's because it's from Low. There's the A New Career in a New Town is sampled. The song A New Career in a New Town is sampled on I Can't Give Everything Away, which is just so wonderful. It's just such a beautiful little callback, and I think it works so well.
It's really a song that I think kind of harkens back to the Bowie that was at his peak creatively, commercially. Yeah, a lot of a lot of synth going on. I think there's even a bit of harmonica. And it is very much like, Dollar Days was kind of like the soft, you think the movie's going to end, the hero is like down, and then it just like swells up into like this big thing. And it's like, if you look at it as a whole, rather than a collection of songs, it is very much like kind of the antithesis of Blackstar, which was like this very kind of sad, kind of haunting, ghost-like song, which eventually like revs up, and then you have I Can't Give Everything Away, which just like blasts out. Like Bowie is not going to go down without a fight.
Right. Right. I know. I agree. I think that's the perfect way to sum it up. And it's interesting that this is the first choice for us to do is the first album on the podcast. I think because it's really an album. Like I think as a concept, the album works extremely well. It just flows together well. The opening with Blackstar, like you mentioned, really sets the tone. You have Lazarus as sort of the centerpiece. You have sort of the chaos of Sue. You have and 'Tis a Pity. You have sort of like the anger phase there with Girl Loves Me with Girl Loves Me, and then you have Dollar Days, which seems like it's the last chapter. You know, our hero is down, and then I Can't Give Everything Away is sort of like the walk into the sunset, it'll be all right kind of moment.
It's like the end of Rocky Horror Picture Show when everything is exploded and everyone's dying, and Tim Curry's like doing the last song, the rubble of everything. Like this is like he's like making the statement which defines him as a person. You know, I think that's what Bowie's doing on that song. He's saying, I can't give everything away, which is what he eventually lived up to. He couldn't give everything of himself away. And I think it was intentional, and I think specifically kind of structured this album to kind of have this sort of, I guess, this subtext of death, but also remembrance and kind of like the celebration of David Bowie. Like I said, this is an incredibly good album. Probably, I would say, one of my favorite David Bowie albums. But I think like it sounds so different. Like even though there's like a lot of these kind of like touches of like modern music in this album, I think it's very kind of a bit difficult to like dig into because it doesn't really sound like anything Bowie's done before in like a direct sense. And it doesn't really sound like anything that's going on right now. Like, I don't know if I could like be like throw Blackstar as like the first recommendation if someone asked me what Bowie albums should I listen to. You get to Blackstar eventually. You don't open with Blackstar.
Right. No, I don't disagree with you. I think it's an amazing album. If you're a fan of music and you really enjoy, like you really get into music, you love, alternative music, then you'll enjoy this album. But yeah, in general, you couldn't recommend this as the first, Bowie album for someone to listen to. In fact, it's probably like, like the higher skill. It'd probably be the highest skill level for any Bowie album. You know what I mean? Like, I think it would be sort of the pinnacle. If you really want a great album, then you really become invested in Bowie. Then you have to hear Blackstar. But is there anything else that you?
I don't know if there's going to be another artist like David Bowie. I don't know if anyone could effortlessly drift from genre to genre.
I agree with you. I don't know, especially if the way things are now, if time would allow for that. So I agree with you. I think it's a good point there. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. This is the first podcast of what will hopefully be many of the Albums Only podcast. My name is Alan Beavers. Alongside me has been Jacob Slater. We'll return to you real soon with the second Albums Only podcast. It will be of Miles Davis, Bitches Brew. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.